And so is this a creature or is this a spell card? Because if it's a creature card, then the focus is on the creature themselves, right? If it's a spell card, it's focused on what the creature is doing. And so this reads more like a creature card. The only reason that I'm bringing that up and why you might want to like be careful of how it's composed is because you have the creature that is like taking up the majority of the space for sure, but you also have this other character here that's like pretty in the frame. If I were to zoom out, they're taking up a good amount of real estate in the image. So there's like potentially some quick fixes you could do for that. One might just be to like kind of expand the canvas a little bit to bring that person a little bit further off of the canvas and make sure that the owl is like really there. Alternatively, you could just really try to close in this character's shape to make it even simpler or as simple as possible.
We got one
Um,
subscriber asking, "Are you into plants?"
am I into plants? I am not. My wife likes plants, and even then, I mean, she's good at taking care of them, a hell of a lot better than I would be. But it is difficult for us to keep any of them alive. Um, so
Okay,
no plants for me.
okay. Sorry, guys. Forrest is not a plant Tito, even though
I'm
his name's
actually
Forrest.
I'm really opposed to plants. Just philosophically, really can't stand them. Um,
Does does that feel weird when your name's Forrest?
it definitely gets yeah, it gets pointed at a lot of the times. I think the biggest thing I get with my name is that I was born, I think, the year or a year after the movie Forrest Gump came out. And
Oh,
so
that makes
that's
sense now.
usually that's the biggest thing. I was not named after Forrest Gump, um, but I get many jokes about Forrest Gump. So I don't really mind the nature ones so much because I'm like, yeah, okay. Um, okay, so want me to just like read through these and
Sure.
okay,
Yeah.
cool. Um, so this is from Vaughn. Artwork title is Lambana. Description and intention of the work. Artwork for my personal project about Philippine mythology. That's my take on one of the Philippine folklore's fays. These fairies are benevolent nature spirits that guard forests and guide humans that get lost in the forest. Creature illustrations that I'm making for this project is intended to work also on TCG illustrations, specifically for Magic. Specific points you want to be checked. I would like my artwork to look more like a traditional painting. I've been experimenting on some canvas textures and would like to keep most of the elements in the background as shapes / silhouettes, like some of Steve Prescott's work. I love Steve Prescott's work. He's one of my favorite Magic artists. I would also love to paint like Steve Prescott. Um, yeah, let me check this out. Let me zoom in on this. I think this image is actually already really strong. Um, it's kind of general feedback. You're mostly looking at like trying to make it feel more traditional and stuff like that. But I hope you don't mind if I give like a little bit of some like Magic TCG feedback as well. I think something that when I initially saw this piece that was kind of standing out to me is that it's a little hard to read, especially from a small size. And so if I were to zoom out, this is what I do with all of my card art. That I do is I just often will keep it pretty zoomed out, even though I have the navigator up here. And if I can't really like clearly see what the focal point is, or it might seem like it's reading a little funky or something like that, then I usually try to clear it up. And I think there's just a couple things that I personally would change to increase that clarity. Um, and it's that I would want this little guy to be just a little bit bigger, take up a little bit more space in the image. Um, I wouldn't be afraid of having some of the silhouette go off the canvas. You kind of have that wing back here kind of going down. But right now it does feel a little bit like this is sort of like pasted in and it's not really integrated into the environment. So what I tend to do, I mean, if you're looking at magic as a general style, the thing that I always kind of point to is that you're trying to do realism, and I should say, if you're trying to initially get hired by them, most of the time, if you're trying to sort of do like get to a minimum of what magic's requirements of style are, it's realism, and in uh, and primarily you're trying to sell three-dimensional space. And so if you kind of have this creature and it's not integrated into the environment in a way that makes it seem as if there's depth, um, then that three-dimensional space isn't being sold as well. And so one of those things is like there's no objects in here that are like intersecting with any of the silhouette here. And so that's something that I tend to do is I tend to try to check for like, is there any way that I can help sell that this thing is in front or behind other objects? Um, and so having like some of these twigs and stuff like that kind of coming in, jutting in, stuff like that, I think is one way. Having the butterfly sort of intersect. Like you still want it to be generally a clear silhouette, but it doesn't need to be. There's certain sections of the silhouette that I don't think need to be as clear because you have very like busy, 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 and then clear silhouette, and I think that's really good. It's a really good composition. Um, and if that's the case, then I think you're probably good with getting some things in the foreground to kind of intersect here. Um, and then as far as like tips for traditional stuff, I also really, I personally really like traditional work. I look at a lot of Jesper Ising, Steve Prescott. Um, Basically, like every one of my favorite magic artists are traditional artists. And so what I've found, there's always brushes that you can get. So I personally experiment with Greg Rakowski's brushes a lot. A lot of very good digital texture brushes that you can utilize. And then I try, if I can, to not use any sort of like basically all of my brushes have to have texture to them. So if I'm doing like a soft brush, like I would do this for World of Warcraft, I do that for Riot, all that type of stuff. But I try my best not to use these types of brushes or this type of brush or even like a basic round brush if I can help it. Everything has to have some sort of like texture associated with it. Um, and I also just don't work on layers. If I can help it, I try to not work on any layers whatsoever because if you're going to try and emulate a traditional look, like you can't have layers necessarily traditionally, so just paint over on top of everything. And those little bits of like inconsistencies with like brush strokes where it looks like a stroke is sort of like intersecting another brush stroke or something like that. It's not necessarily that you plan for that, but I think those things are just naturally going to come out if you're just painting everything on one layer. Does all this sound like it's making sense so far?
To me, it does. I believe
Okay, cool.
Fawn is here in the audience, so I think he's still reeling back, like you're critiquing over his work.
um, and then, I mean, if I were to make like any slight adjustments to the overall uh, like composition, I suppose, just the distribution of shapes. Some of what's kind of causing some busyness is like some of the flowing of these wings. They're kind of going and emulating the shape of the leaves. I Part of me likes it. I don't know if this is necessarily a real critique. I think it's just something to consider. Is that I think some of those shapes can get a little bit lost. Um, and I would just be careful to make sure that if these shapes are going to be getting lost because they're very similar to the leaf shapes and how they're sort of flowing, then try to make sure that the other shapes of the character that you really, really want to pop off, like here in this primary like focal point, make sure that those are really, really clear and really strong, strong shapes. Um, so I'd like really lean into the fact that this is this energy here happening with this shape. That's like really, really strong. Um, and so I would actually like push that even further a little bit just to really, really exaggerate it. This is personal preference, though. It gets a little bit more into stylization, which you can get away with a little bit in Magic. Obviously, you can't go too stylized, but their guidelines are sort of changing. Used to be you had to be very, very realistic, but now they have a little bit more leeway. But yeah, I mean, that's all my feedback on this one. I think this is already like a really, really strong piece. Um, and yeah, if your primary concern is, I mean, making it traditional and making sure it's like stronger for card art, I think there's pretty minimal changes to get it there. It's really cool design, really good composition. I like it.
Right. There you go, Vaughn. All right, he's there in the audience. He gave the praying hands emoji.
Oh, good. Um, and then there's Braddockser. Let me make this a little bigger. Um, Barn Owl Night. Description and intention of the artwork. A scene of a humanoid owl apprehending a criminal with the focus on the owl. The artwork was intended to mimic the feel of a magic card. Specific points you want to be checked, composition and lighting / values. This is also a really strong piece. I always recommend artists, like, if you're going to try and work for Magic, the toughest thing to try and help sell that is that you need to try and sell the three-dimensional space. And there's kind of two ways of doing that. There's having characters interact with their surrounding environment, or there's characters interacting with other characters. So having one person that is being like grabbed and apprehended and they're interacting in multiple ways, right? It's not just like this barn owl's reaching over and like grabbing the arm or something. This is like a full acted pose and everything. That's solid. It's really great. There's like little things that I could talk about, nitpicks about anatomy and stuff like that, but like I don't think that's the primary issue. If there's a primary issue or anything to like improve on this piece, I don't think that's it. So overall, as far as like the technical skill that you have to sell to be able to show that, okay, you could do magic work, like it's definitely it's definitely showing that. So I think that's really strong. um a couple things that I would change. I mean, you mentioned composition and lighting and values. At this point, when it comes to the composition, I don't think it's necessarily worth investing a ton of time changing it. um any sort of compositional changes, I think that should probably come a lot earlier, unless it were something like simple, like there's one change and like there's a little bit of a tangent here with the roof, so that's kind of a little bit awkward because it looks like it's going up his butt. You probably don't want that, so maybe just have that sort of intersect with this shape a little bit stronger. Maybe a little tangential there as well. Maybe have a little bit of some sort of like value separation with his legs or something like that, just to get a clearer read. Same with like on the bottom of his arm or something. Um, just like little things like that, but no major changes to any of the shapes. Also, maybe I would like. It looks like the sword is. I can't tell if this is one of those like super wiggly, wavy swords, or if this is like a bent sword because the owl's so strong. Um, but if it's a super wiggly sword or a bent sword, either one, I would just like have it kind of pop out a little bit more um, from the silhouette of the owl, because right now, from a small size, it's kind of hard to tell what it is. Um, so maybe just make sure it's part of that same like owls like value grouping, and just yeah extend that a little bit. Um, but yeah, I mean, compositionally, I think that this is really strong. I think that if I were to kind of zoom out, if there's anything that's really bothering me, maybe I would fill this gap in. Just having some of those values down there. I'm kind of thinking like what's necessary, what's not necessary for having the like upward sort of flow into the barn owl and what they're doing. Um, Maybe this. The only reason I don't like this being down here is because you have two shapes, very similar size, very similar flow, all going in the same direction. So I would just kind of like maybe fill that with the back of like a cloak or something like that. Something like that. You don't really need a whole lot of info down here because it's all flowing upwards. this shape kind of goes against the overall flow of what you're trying to do. So I would maybe just like adjust that shape a little bit just to kind of get that as a little bit more smoother of a curvature upwards. Having longer stretches in your shape also to sort of just have the eyes rest, I think is nice because you want like complex silhouette up here. So as you're moving away, it can start to simplify as the eyes sort of rest and work their way up into that like really cool dynamic silhouette. And in fact, you could even get like wilder with this, right? You can have like maybe the hood's got like a little peak to it or something. Maybe there's like even more feathers. Maybe the beak like breaks out a little bit. Stuff like that. This is getting pretty like fine tuned though. Overall, this is still like really, really strong piece. Um, and oh gosh. One other tip, because this is really good, so I don't really have a whole lot to say on this, but something that I think is just really useful when you're trying to do sort of like fake magic cards for your portfolio is I think that it's really important to try and consider what this card is going to be. Not necessarily the effect. You won't know the effect of a card, but at the very least, you're going to know whether this is a, I guess, if I were to summarize it and not go full magic nerd on you and explain every card type, but there's creatures and then there's just like spells, I guess, or sorceries. And so is this a creature or is this a spell card? Because if it's a creature card, then the focus is on the creature themselves, right? If it's a spell card, it's focused on what the creature is doing. And so this reads more like a creature card. The only reason that I'm bringing that up and why you might want to like be careful of how it's composed is because you have the creature that is like taking up the majority of the space for sure, but you also have this other character here that's like pretty in the frame. If I were to zoom out, they're taking up a good amount of real estate in the image. So there's like potentially some quick fixes you could do for that. One might just be to like kind of expand the canvas a little bit to bring that person a little bit further off of the canvas and make sure that the owl is like really there. Alternatively, you could just really try to close in this character's shape to make it even simpler or as simple as possible. And then really, really exaggerate the owl's shape, like get a lot more spikes, get a lot more dynamic of a silhouette in order to really have it sort of pop off. Just to really make it clear that like that owl is the overall focus. But even if you don't make changes to that now, I think it's still like in a good enough state that you wouldn't have to change that. But it's something that I thought I'd mention because I think it's advice that I was given when I started working on magic stuff, and I think it's kind of stuck with me since then.
Oh, there's one question here
Oh yeah.
from Ella. Do you have any tips for the range of values to achieve that traditional feeling? You mentioned using brushes to help.
Mm. Um, I wouldn't worry if it's a value focused thing. I wouldn't worry too much about the brush that you use. Um, Instead, I would think, how would you build it up if you were working traditionally? I've seen a lot of artists that, and some very successfully, that what they'll do is they'll paint digitally and then they'll go back over their digital painting and try to like messy it up to make it look traditional. I've personally never been a huge fan of that, only because I feel like you can really tell. Like it still feels like it's like a digital painting, but that's traditionally inspired, and it's like a little funky for my taste. Um, but how I end up looking usually at traditional artists and how they build up their values is usually I'll see something like, if I were to use this artist's work as an example, um, there's a lot more shadow melding than what digital artists do. A lot of digital artists, what they'll do is they'll draw everything with very like fine detail. They'll get all the line art in and stuff, and then they'll start blocking in the colors. So it's like, well, I've got my armor color and I've got my leather color and my clothes, and then you start rendering. And the problem is that everything then sort of becomes the same level of interest and detail. And so, what I usually do instead is I try to just knock out the areas that don't need to be there, right? And I use shadow melding as a way of just sort of letting the eyes rest back here. And instead, you just have the values sort of like emanate outwards and grow. It's like very much if you look at like Frank Frazetta's work, a lot of like pen and ink sort of artists end up doing it this way, where there's a lot of really strong shadow shapes that they sort of carve out and will take up a large amount of space in the image. And I find that this is like pretty freeing when I do this too, because I'm not being super beholden to like this really tight drawing that I have underneath it of like all the detail and stuff like that. Um, you don't need to do it this way, but this is definitely one way that I've kind of noticed like traditional artists will build up. Usually, it starts from them having some sort of like a mid-tone base that is like a wash over all their line art, right? And then at some point you end up sort of like building up the darks and you build up the lights into the form that you inevitably have. So that's kind of how I go about it. Does that make
That
sense?
was Ella. You good? Oh, oh, she gave the nail polish emoji, so I'm guessing that means
That must be good.
oh, she says thank you.
Oh, okay, cool.
Okay.
Is it cool that I just give feedback to all these? I don't know if that's like usual.
Oh, dude, everyone's enjoying
Oh, okay.
it. They're
All
all
right, cool.
internally combusting.
All right. Artwork title: Hatsune Miku. Description and intention of the work: fan art of Hatsune Miku performing a concert at a cyber-esque venue. I wanted to capture a pop idol moment, just like Seraphine from League of Legends. I know that game. Specific points you want to be checked. Hoping to get some feedback mainly on composition and lighting. Also, some suggestions on the background. Cool. Yeah, I think that this is already looking really strong. Like render wise, I think I said it earlier in the interview portion, but I like 99% of my real critical feedback, especially if like you're aspiring to work for league stuff, is like drawing. Drawing is number one all the time. Everyone thinks it's rendering. Everyone's super impressed with rendering. It's not a big deal. Don't worry about the rendering. The rendering will come. The better you get at drawing and being able to visualize three-dimensional form, the better that you're going to be able to actually understand. It's going to make your rendering skills improve faster. But if you have a poor drawing, you'll always have a poor drawing under like a really polished painted image or whatever, right? But if you have a really great drawing, um, whatever, someone else can always paint it for you, I suppose, if it comes down to it, which does happen. But I just think that ends up extending much further. I won't talk necessarily about the drawing right now because you're primarily looking at composition and lighting, and drawing and adjusting that is like a ton of work. So don't worry about that. But just thought I'd throw that out there. Um, as far as like composition, something that I personally tend to try and move away from whenever I can with league stuff is I always try to think of what the story is trying to be. And so if this is like pop idol Seraphine type thing, then like having a big crowd of people, huge stadium, huge dome. Maybe you see the top of the dome and there's lots of crazy lights. Maybe there's like pedestals in the background and there's backup dancers and stuff like that. Like you go crazy, right? Like look at like the wildest show. Look at Lady Gaga. Look at I don't know who Chapel Roan just did a crazy VMA thing. Like look at all of these wild shows and just think like how could you showcase that in the background, um, and compositionally what's going to be like the best shot for that. I think what I end up seeing a lot of students do is a lot of students kind of are kind of doing what you're doing, so I don't mean to pick on you, I'm very sorry, but I think that doing like really nice like dynamic pose is not necessarily always the best option. And I think that if you look at a lot of newer league art, there's definitely a lot of really big dynamic poses, but I think there's a lot more integration into the story and skin line that they're currently selling nowadays than there previously was. It's also that a lot of the times you you see these skins that end up like I guess having a lot more like subtle poses than you expected. Maybe for the character, I think sometimes it's because they end up being like vertical, so you need to have that like vertical orientation that they can be cropped. And so when you end up having one that is like maybe a little bit more diagonal and that like extends across the canvas and stuff, if I were to like crop this vertically, I feel like I wouldn't end up seeing like a big portion of this character's like silhouette, because it seems like the hair is like such a huge important part. So I would say like maybe, and you might still be able to do this, I don't know, but like maybe zooming out, trying to bring that hair in a little bit more, but still trying to find that like pop pose. Like I said, you don't have to change the drawing. That's like a huge change, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. Um but yeah, I think right now this is feeling like a little bit more sort of just like cool dynamic pose, but it's not like this is a pop star singing to a crowd, and it's also not evoking necessarily like a specific feeling, and that's usually what I'm trying to aim for. If you are selling some sort of a pose, like trying to sell what is the story, what is the purpose of this character, and what's the feeling that the players should have when they see this. Is it cool? Is it cute? Is it sexy? Like what are you wanting someone to feel when they embody that skin? And so far, like it's a little cute, it's kind of dynamic, but I don't think it's necessarily selling any one particular fantasy currently. um, and then lighting. So as far as lighting goes, the tip that I tend to give, this is something I learned when working on Legends of Runeterra, and I was like obsessively looking at Six More Vodka's work like every day. Um, this isn't like an absolute rule, so definitely take it with a grain of salt, but it's maybe something to start considering if you're trying to work on something that's like maybe a little bit more splash arty. Is most of the time these images will have three light sources, probably no more than three, unless there's like some subtle light sources like somewhere else, like a small, maybe there's like underlighting right here or something like that on the legs. um, but whatever your light sources are should kind of exist in some sort of like a hierarchy. And so let's say that you've got your central light that's kind of hitting the character right from behind the camera, somewhere up back here behind us. You've got your sort of rim lighting. So we're kind of seeing that like it's kind of coming down here. I'll talk about how it's not, that rim light's not hitting any of this. I don't know if it's coming from the disc, but we'll fix that. But so let's say you've got your rim light, you've got your center light, and I don't know. We'll say that there's another light source coming from this way. This one's going to be like really behind, and this one's just going to be kind of like at an upward angle, just a little off camera. Um, Whatever those light sources are, um, should probably not be competing for attention. And so what I commonly see, I think your piece is doing like a fine job of this. So I wouldn't worry too much about the way that you're doing it, but this is just something I thought I'd mention because I think it's a good tip for lighting. Is I would like categorize these as like, okay, this is my like primary. So this is like my brightest light source. This is my second brightest light source, and then this is my third brightest light source, or something like that. And the reason I say that is because let's say if you ended up having another rim light similar to what you got here on the leg. Let me just add it here to the arms and stuff like that, maybe on the hair. Let's say you have another rim light. It's like the exact same level of intensity and the exact same color temperature, and it's on this side, and it's hitting the hair back here. What's going to end up happening is you have now like two light sources that are trying to sell this like sense of form, but that are competing for attention, right? So you might have some there, and then you'd have some like here. And when you have two light sources that are like basically the same intensity competing for attention, it actually ends up like flattening the piece, and it ends up adding like way too much contrast, and it removes a lot of readability. If you end up having more of this smooth sort of like primary, secondary, tertiary light source, then it becomes a lot more readable, and there's no light that's necessarily competing for the viewer's attention. Um, if that makes sense.
Oh, she has a question. The artist
Oh
behind
yeah,
this.
sure.
So, Ishi is asking, is there a specific program or website to use to set up the lighting? I think references may not exactly capture what you're looking when painting.
Hmm. Um, I don't know if I have any like programs that would necessarily help you capture the lighting in that way. The way that I personally got a lot better at doing this was doing screen capture studies from like Pixar movies, um, especially Pixar movies, because you get a lot of like really big, simple shapes from Pixar characters. Um, and it's a lot easier for you to sort of point out and like doing a study where you're kind of figuring out like, okay, it looks like there's a light source coming from this way, it looks like there's a light source coming from off camera this way, and there's like a light source coming from this way or something. And then painting that up and trying to see like identifying like, oh, this is a warm light source, this is a cool light source, this is a neutral one, or whatever. Doing that and trying to be more and more mindful of where your light sources are coming from and what intensity they are. Like, I think that's all it really is. There's form. Form is definitely, I think, the toughest thing for people to kind of wrap their heads around. Because I mean, it's selling three dimensional uh, space and through lighting, and I think that selling three dimensional space is like the toughest thing to do with as a technical skill for art. Um, and so that's a little bit tougher. I personally got a lot better at selling light and form when I improved my drawing skills, because that helped me visualize three dimensional form a lot better. And also, I would do like still life studies on my desk. I would get like blackout curtains, and I just got as much all the lighting I could possibly get out of my office, and I would get like a tablecloth or something and just like a simple object like an apple or a ball or something, and I'd shine a lamp on it. And it's because if you're before you can end up, working on an image that has three light sources from around it, you need to be able to see what does it look like if there's just an object with one light source on it, and how does that one light source end up interacting with the object as I'm rotating it around and shining it in different spots and stuff like that. um, so that's kind of it's doing stuff like that that helped me sort of like recognize like, oh, okay, rim light is not just like a line that hugs around the body. It like intersects into form, and when it gets thinner, that's usually when it gets brighter, and so when it moves away from the edge, it starts to become, it's still super bright but it's not as bright, and it's because it's not pinching the highlight on the edge of the form, and like you start recognizing those types of things. if that makes sense.
Let us know, Ishi, if you got any more questions. Sent like the heart emoji. Oh, she says I see with two exclamations, so it's pretty clear.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Oh, she's all
Um,
good.
sweet. But yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty much it. I think having like dynamic lighting like that, like I said, it's not necessarily you'd want to do this with every single image, right? There's plenty of splash images that only have one primary light source, and then they maybe like really emphasize like the ambient light or something. But it's a good, easy way of making something feel more exciting and I guess dynamically lit, I suppose.
She says, "Thank you so much, Mr. Emil. May you eat the best sinigang." Oh, that's a Filipino dish.
What is it called?
Sinigang. It's a
Senegal?
sinigang.
Sinigang.
Yeah, it's a sour soup.
Oh.
Or yeah.
Wait, what is it? What's in it?
Could be shrimp, could be pork.
Oh, hell yeah. All right. I'll have pork soup.
Oh, there we go.
Sure.
It's a pretty known dish. That was pretty random issue, but uh, I think now you've stirred the pot.
I don't know if we have any Filipino restaurants near us, but now I'll have to look so that I'll know one dish at least. I'll know what to order.
There we go. Highly recommended. All right. Oh, I believe this is JC's. There we go.
Cool. All right. Um, Artwork title, Amalgamation of Fear, description and intention of the work, an art piece for an art jam, basically an art that shows different kinds of fears at once, like the gold-coated skull or statue for arophobia, necrophobia, and claustrophobia, the flying pose for arachnophobia, the holes for trypophobia, and the tentacles for the chapodophobia. I don't even know what that is. Specific points you want to be checked. I want to learn on how to push this artwork furthermore. In my eyes, it is a finished artwork, but I know for a fact that this is a bit raw. What can I improve more about this artwork? So, as far as like, uh, so you saying that this looks finished to you, but you feel like it's not, that is entirely up to like, it's either your standards, your personal standards, or whatever your like aspirational goals of client work are, right? Always consider that like the standards of what is a finished image has to always be set by something. If you want to work in the industry as a commercial artist, those standards are going to fluctuate. The standards for working on Fortnite are going to be different than if you're working on uh, Farmville, I guess. I don't know. Um, and it's not that like both might still still take a lot of skill. It's maybe a little bit different use of the skill, but it's knowing what that is. And so if this is like the standards of like League Splash, that's going to be different than the standards of like Magic the Gathering. Based off of kind of what I'm seeing here, it looks a little bit closer to splash art. It's got this sort of like fisheye lens. It looks like it's a lot more dynamic. There's a lot more vibrant colors. So I'm probably just going to go off of that, unless they're here and can like correct it and say what client maybe they are wanting to aim for.
I did their quick little research. Chapodophobia is the fear of octopi. I didn't know that was
Okay. Well, that makes
that's a
sense.
thing.
Um, so couple things. If this were like, okay, let's say embodiment of fear, and we're trying to sell like League Splash style or something like that, right? Um, I'm gonna kind of use this more as like a general feedback since it's not super specific. It's a little bit like on how to finish it, but I'll kind of talk about more like maybe like the overall image's impact and general direction. Um, is that I kind of wish that I could see a lot more of the design here of the character. I feel like I'm not really able to get a good sense of what is like where their body is, where their appendages are. I see like arm and hand, and I'm assuming that this is also an arm. But a lot of this is sort of hidden, and it makes it really difficult for me to be able to determine like what is this character, what would they look like, what's their silhouette. On top of that, I think that this is sort of like amalgamation of fear. So, and you've got like in the design all of these really great motifs for that. I think that's really, really cool. Um, but I think the combination of like really smooth curves like this all throughout and the like really saturated color scheme is kind of competing with the overall like theme and feel of the character. And so I would imagine this character being more like, I don't know, like more in like super foggy, uh, like eerie sort of an environment. And like it kind of looks like there's like almost like a big island behind them or something like that. And I'd imagine like a lot of this is a lot more desaturated. You can pump up the saturation in like certain areas. But like if I were to just kind of paint on this for like a second, I would just like, oh, if I can get my brush working, like really pushing some of that like obscurity with that fog. And like you got these like tentacles which are super super cool to add into the design. But again, it's like amalgamation of fear is like, what is that, right? And when I think of fear, I think like, okay, you're thinking like the unknown, you're thinking of like obscure shapes, thinking you're seeing something that you're not really seeing, like all sorts of stuff like that. um, and so like I think it'd be really cool if like you still had some of these tentacles, maybe a little less rounded, so that it doesn't seem like it's so like friendly. Um, but maybe you just saw like these kind of obscure tentacles, like all in this like foggy area, right? Like maybe they're kind of around, maybe they go into the fog, maybe as they come out of the fog they get a little bit more defined, there's more definition. You see a little bit more of like the actual texture to them and stuff like that. But something that like really sells what this design is, and I might be missing some context here, so I'm sorry if that's the case, but this is just kind of what was my like initial thoughts when seeing this.
Fortunately, I think JC's knocked out. So, oh, he had like a online course earlier this morning, like
Okay.
3 a.m. in Underpaint. So he'll probably see this when he wakes up.
I'm sure he's going to be like, all this is wrong, this isn't what the design is supposed to be, and I'll have to
Oops.
apologize profusely. um and then yeah, I mean like seeing like the hair, it's kind of like all bunched up, so I think trying to hair's tough, guys.
Mm.
What I tend to do is I tend to focus a lot on like mass shapes and having like smaller shapes then start to come out from there. I also use the lasso tool a lot, but that's just my personal preference. So I'm still kind of keeping some of these like smooth curves in, but I think I want to end them with these like sharp points. And I mean, this is like, this could be all sorts of things, right? There might be a good reason why you had more curved shapes as opposed to um, something maybe more like angular, or dramatic or something. I definitely think like too angular, that doesn't quite feel right for like fear, that's a little bit more aggressive. But something that sort of breaks out a little bit, right? Like makes it look a little like knotted up or something, like there's lots of like stray hairs that are sort of breaking out. I'm thinking like gross like witches that you'd see in like movies and stuff like that. Have like loose tendrily hairs. And so like this is previously what it was. And you can see, I mean, hopefully you kind of see what I mean when I'm like comparing the two, how like you can still kind of have some of that color in there. I think that um as I'm pumping up the color and some of the cooler color schemes, like you're still getting this like warmth for the rest of the character. That's still kind of coming through. but it doesn't need to be like as saturated as it previously was. Um, and this is feeling, yeah, a lot more like cartoonish. It's feeling a lot more like I'd see this for like a mobile game or something like that. And maybe that's the intention. I don't know, but um, those were just kind of my initial thoughts when seeing it. And as far as like taking it to finals, like I said, that I would need to know exactly what the client is that you're pursuing or what your general aspirations are. But like, let's say if it's like league work, for instance, right? Like, I'd want to try and make sure that, well, for sure, no line art. Definitely get line art out of there. There's certain styles of league stuff where they keep the line art, but that's like more unique. That's more specific to what that skin line is. Um, and just focusing a lot on trying to sell whatever these like different materials are. Um, and I mean, material rendering, that's like, oh, geez, that's a whole other topic. There's a lot to cover when it comes to that. But at the very least, what I think, focus on, if I was to give like really basic advice of how you could take this from where it currently is to a more finished state, is like try to focus on one silhouette, or sorry, geez, not silhouette. I'm losing it. Focus on one light source, have that be your like primary light source, and just try to really really effectively paint from that light source. And like by getting rid of all the line art and all that stuff, how can you best sell that one light source aimed at this one figure or object. um, and if you need help for lighting and stuff like that, I mentioned some things you could do earlier, but on top of that, especially for skulls, I found that going online and looking up free 3D models of Asaro heads, it's Asaro heads, and like just kind of painting Asaro heads from like all sorts of different angles, different lighting scenarios, stuff like that, is super super helpful. Uh, Especially for, it's also helpful for portraits as well. It's not just skulls, but um, basically just any sort of head that you might need to paint from different angles. Painting Asaro heads is very very helpful. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense. You're not here, so I won't know, but I'll assume that everything makes sense.
He's probably tossing and turning in bed. Like, I feel like I'm missing something.
All right. And then one more, I think, right?
Oh, quick little tangent question from Ella.
Yeah, yeah.
She is asking, do you offer mentorships or courses online?
I do not. I used to do a mentorship through CGMA, but it just got to be too much when I started at Blizzard. I have like some beginners, like art fundamental, like hour long, hour and a half long. It's tough to say courses. It's more of like a lecture. Um, it's kind of up to you on if you feel like you're at that level that it's going to be really beneficial for you. But I basically just talk all about like, um, I guess, beginning fundamental aspects. So if you don't know really anything about color and light, I talk a lot about color and light. I talk about different terms that are used, what those terms mean. I end each video with like how to study and improve and stuff like that. But yeah, no like official mentorship. Okay, Capricorn Sphinx. A different take on the zodiac sign Capricorn, merging a Sphinx and the Capricorn, but with an added fantasy twist and realism. Specific points: how to be efficient at rendering scales and or shortcuts on how to render them. Also, how to make the drawing more interesting and dynamic. Cool. I don't know enough about Capricorns, but I think they're goat things, right? They're
I
Are they sea
think so.
goats?
I believe so.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, like a sea goat.
What are you, by the way? I'm a Gemini.
I am a Virgo Leo cusp. Very unique.
Oh, okay. Gonna have to
I don't know.
research that.
That's just what I've been told.
Oh, okay, because same, I don't know. Like, oh, you're such a Gemini. What's that supposed to mean? Like, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, my wife brings that stuff up a lot because she knows it bothers me, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what any of that means. My Neptune is rising. So okay. Colors. What was this? Sorry. Rendering scales, shortcuts on how to render them, how to make drawing more interesting and dynamic. Um, I'll start with the drawing first. Um, I think it's really tough because I could kind of give tips on how to make drawings more dynamic. But I think that when you're starting out, it's so difficult just trying to draw something like correctly, like quote unquote correctly. Assuming you're going for realism, trying to get like a cylinder to look like it's actually like a cylinder in three-dimensional space is just already difficult to do. And then suddenly you have to add on that cylinder also is at like a slight angle to a box, and that box is actually a bicep, and at the end is maybe some sort of a sphere that it inserts into. It's just a lot to try and like really nail down. And your brain has to be like working really, really hard to do that. That to also talk about how you then take this shape and now you got to make it look cool is just I think like I'll give some tips. I'll give kind of some philosophies on that, but I'd say like don't stress too much about that. There's little tips for like design and stuff like that you can consider, but like focusing a lot on this first until this enters into your subconscious and you're just able to recognize this without having to think too hard, and then you can start designing, right? Otherwise, what ends up happening, and I'm sure many artists here are familiar with this, like I did this all the time. I would spend like 2 hours just drawing a face because I just couldn't draw this face and get it to look right. And then the minute that a face would finally be drawn, what I thought was well, I didn't want to touch it because I was worried that if I touched it, I'd make it look bad again. And that's just trying to make it look correct. So if I'm also trying to make it look really, really cool, or trying to sell the design of it or something like that, like it's just so much for your brain to think about that I just wouldn't stress about it too much. um that being said, a couple things that I personally tend to try to avoid is I try to avoid areas like this, where if you end up having two shapes that are sort of next to each other, I'm sure if you open up an anatomy book, you'll probably see some sort of a shape like this explained, probably in the gesture section, where you end up having like different gestural flows go into one another. This is sort of like anatomy at its base, generally has this sort of gestural flow throughout it. And so if I were to sort of draw that, you could see it's like, oh, it's the deltoid into the tricep, into the bicep, down to the elbow, into the forearm muscle, down into the hand. And so, like that gestural flow, you're going to see that throughout pretty much all anatomy, right? It's this asymmetry that makes it feel natural. So when you have these symmetrical shapes, it ends up sort of like I don't know, it feels like pudgy. It feels like not necessarily natural, right? It's like I don't know. It's like a little ball or something. Um, so even something as simple as something I mean, small design thing I always decide is, do I end up having the tricep go in with the line of the deltoid? That's like one small decision that you can make, right? Because you could have it not go in line with the deltoid and you have the tricep pop out a little bit. But if you do that, now this is sort of this like insertion that I want to try and balance out down here, right? Alternatively, though, you could have it be where you end up having this merge and this shape is sort of like its own thing, and then you could get away with having like a little bit more kind of like short bulbous of a bicep shape there. Um, but it's little things like that that I kind of think about. And on top of that, I am always thinking about shape design, in that I'm always thinking about small and medium and large shapes, and the balance of that. Beyond just small, medium, large shapes, I think a lot of people think of shapes, they think of them like this, like that's a shape, that's a shape, this is a shape. That's definitely true. But on top of that, I'm also thinking of small, medium, large in terms of like silhouette. So like here, you've kind of got I guess like a small shape, large shape, right? And so if I'm seeing something like these two shapes together in this way before it ends up getting stopped there, that's like a little too similar. And it's also too much of like curve into one another, right? So there's like two things that I'm watching for there. I'm watching to make sure that there's enough balance of small, medium, and large, which right now there's like two larges that are taking up a good amount of space. And also this sort of connects into like another large shape around here. So a lot of this is a little funky right now. And then on top of and beyond that, there's three very similar repeated patterns over one another. And so personally, I would just like probably simplify a lot of this. I'd probably end up having it go something like this, where you end up having it sort of extend. There's all sorts of different ways you could do this. So, like, even if you don't like how this looks, there's like other ways you could go about it. But like trying to simplify it in a way and push this one large shape a little further out is one way that you can start to kind of free up that space, right? And not have that same sort of like repeated pattern happening over again. Same with like something like this, right? That same type of thing is kind of happening. So I would probably end up like maybe bringing this leg in, and I think what I want it to do actually is wrap up and around a little bit. If you look at animal legs, they can kind of like wrap around the belly. Sometimes they have this little like bit of like spare I don't know what it is, like skin or something right there. So I might kind of utilize that shape a little bit. Maybe extend this to get that silhouette out a little bit more. And I really want this like belly to kind of be the overall the biggest shape here. Yeah, something maybe like that. And there's all sorts of different combinations you can do with shapes. You know, that's where the fun of designing comes in. But it's like I said, if you're trying to think about how you're even doing these forms, like trying to also design shape on top of that is just really difficult. Um, but that's, if you're gonna think about anything small, medium, large, and thinking about that not only with the interior shapes like this, but also with the outer silhouette is really important. As far as rendering tips for scales, when I think of rendering any sort of a material, I always go back to the form principle. I made a video on this on YouTube because I get asked about the form principle like so much. Actually, that's not true. I don't get asked about it. People just ask me how to paint, and then I talk about the form principle because it's like my only answer. Um, but if you're not familiar with the form principle, it's essentially like it's the principle of lighting. It's the universal truth of lighting. And so if you have a form and or you have an object or whatever, and it's being lit by something, it's going to have a light side. It's going to have a shadow side. That's a given. And then within each side, there's different things. So on the light side, you've got your halftone, you've got your center light. That's the majority of this, and then you've got your highlight. And then if you are in the shadow side, you've got your core shadow. That's pretty much the whole thing. You have technically your terminator. That's the line between light and shadow. It's not always visible, but it's there. And then you've got reflected light. Sometimes, usually, there's reflected light. And then you've got ambient occlusion if it's near a surface on the bottom. And so it's not that I'm thinking about this with each individual scale. So you don't have to think like you have to think like this on every single thing that you're doing. What I do think about though is I think about this on a large scale. So I think about this if I'm painting this whole body, right? I'm thinking about this right here. So I'm thinking, where's the direction of lighting? Let's just say, based off of this, maybe it's some sort of like downward light. Pretty simple, nothing crazy. Something like this. I'm not even sure where the shadow would hit. Probably it would just be like pinched right down here. It probably wouldn't even be like that visible. And then maybe you get some halftone down here. Maybe if you want to get fancy, maybe there's like a little indent because there's a little rib cage maybe being implied right there. So maybe there's like a little bit of kind of an indent. Maybe even, maybe it's a little thinner. So maybe you get a couple more little ribs in there, maybe down here or something. And this is halftone, right? Because it's not technically center light. The form is like shifting slightly. So if you're imagining like this thing working around the outside of this form, right? Eventually the light's going to get to a point that as it's passing this object, it's going to catch. And where it catches on the edge, right? That's where it's going to start transitioning into halftone just before it then transitions into shadow. So that's what I'm kind of trying to get with the rib cage here. Something like that. I'd get a little bit of a highlight in there. Nothing crazy. Might do more of a highlight later on with the scales, but I'm thinking big first. I'm thinking, what is this overall shape first? Trying to paint that in, and then I can get more specific. All right, so let's say that's the body, right? So then if I were to start putting stuff on top of this, think of it kind of like this. Think about you're taking a small object, you're taking a small scale, and that is also sort of, having its own form principle or whatever. It's got its own shadow, it's got its own light. It's a physical object that exists in 3D space. If we were to zoom in on that scale, it's got form, it's got depth, it's got its own sort of shape to it, right? It's got its own side planes, its front plane, all that type of stuff. And now imagine a bunch of these tacked on top of that, right? You don't literally have to draw every single thing. Primarily what you're going to be drawing is you're just going to be drawing where the shadows are. And so if I were to go back to the body here and I'm starting to think about how these scales are going to go, and I'm hoping that this is going to look good as I paint it, I would just think like, what is the overall direction of scales and how can I try and capture that? So I'm not trying to capture each individual scale necessarily. I'm just trying to find the overall direction and pattern of scales. And so a lot of the time scales are not just like consistent all throughout, right? So if we were to kind of looks like alligator scales or maybe what you're going for. So as I'm starting to kind of paint in some of those down here, as it gets closer to the belly, maybe I'll make them a little smaller and I'll have it maybe catch a little bit just on kind of some of these smaller scales. And then if you really want, you could get closer in and you could start like refining them. So if I wanted maybe as this is like transitioning down, maybe this is going to cast a little bit larger of a shadow. because it's like hanging over the form or something like that, right? Maybe it's not like keeping tight to the body. And you could do this all kind of along the body. And eventually, if you really wanted, maybe at a certain point, as the light is shining down, you're maybe not catching shadow anymore because as the light's casting downwards, maybe there's so much bounce light that you're maybe just kind of getting like the very like edge of it, but it's probably just kind of fading at that point. And if that's the case, then you could start implying the scales with highlight, because at that point now maybe you're getting to an angle that the highlight is now starting to be implied. So anyway, that's kind of how I would go about it. I think of different materials as this is something sitting on top of like an overall form that's being lit. So what is that like primary form that's being lit? Paint that up, and then anything on top of that, as like a texture, as a material, whatever, is something that is still going to be affected by that overall light source. I think it can become a little overwhelming when you're thinking of every scale, kind of like how you're doing it, where it's like there's the shadow, there's the drawing, there's the highlight, all of that. You don't really need to think of it in that way. Um, just think major forms first, and then you can start to refine where you feel like it's most necessary. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
I'm not sure if Pao is here in the audience, but she'll just see this recording when it's up.
Cool. You can always hit it with color dodge too, because that's also just it's also just the way to really make it pop off.
Wait, when do you color dodge? Is it usually at the end when you got everything set up?
uh, it's when I start to feel like uh, I feel like it's looking bad. So I want to make it look like it's really cool and vibrant. So then I color dodge it, and it makes me feel better. Um, and it's I'm living a lie, basically, is all it is. I'll color dodge because I'm like, yeah, I don't think what I'm doing is super great right now. Maybe I'll color dodge it. Maybe that'll make it better. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it works, and I'm like, oh yeah, that makes the form pop out a little bit more. Most of the time, it doesn't actually fix it.
All right. If no one has any questions, we'll be wrapping up in a bit.
Cool.
So, oh, are you done giving feedback on that artwork?
Yeah. I think that was it.
Yeah, I think that's everyone. Should be. Did we miss anything? I don't
Yeah, I
think
think
we missed.
5, right?
Yeah, we're good. We're good.
Cool.
All right. I think we can cap it off here. So once again, guys, this has been Mr. Forrest Emil. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for joining us, for giving the time for this little interview. You are our first international guest. So thank you for
I,
gracing
I'm
us.
I'm honored. Thank you for having me.
All right. And yeah, it's now, I believe it's 9:08 there right now.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, okay. So right now it's 12, and I think we can end here. So in this camera right here, are there any socials you want to let the other people know? Or how can we support you? Where can we find you?
Oh gosh, I'm probably everywhere. I just don't post anything. Yeah, I'm on Twitter. I have, if you're interested, I have like Gumroad tutorials. I have a YouTube channel, stuff like that. So you don't have to spend any money. Just go listen to what I talk about on YouTube. Um, and I stream on Twitch pretty often, usually once a week. So I'm actually probably going to stream tomorrow, where I'm going to be doing basically what I did here. I'm going to be giving feedback and just answering questions, talking about whatever. So yeah.
All right. And with that, we can close this off. So once again, thank you, Forrest, so much for your time. And see you guys in our next interview.